Do you remember when we talked about the mafia that is responsible for growing the venture capital industry in Europe? What mafia were we talking about? No, not the PayPal mafia. I'm talking about in Europe. Any ideas? That's right. It was the Skype mafia. As we mentioned in our previous video titled The Mafia That Grew Venture Capital in Europe, it was the founders and early employees of Skype that helped really create the venture capital industry in Europe by growing many companies such as Wise, Atomico, and Starship. In our recent trip to Europe, we stopped by the European Investment Fund, the EIF, the largest investor of private equity and venture capital funds in Europe, where we talked to Bjorn Tremery, the head of technology at the EIF. Bjorn gave us insight into the European venture capital market and talked about quite a few venture capital firms in Europe, including venture capital firms that received investments from the EIF. Now, before I continue, just to throw in a disclaimer, the views expressed in this video do not necessarily reflect the views of the EIF, and that the mere appearance of EIF employees in this video does not constitute an endorsement by EIF or its affiliates of the video content. Well, in this video, we will give you an inside look on how 3 companies started in Europe, received investments from European venture capital firms, and then became unicorns, which are private companies with valuations greater than $1 billion. We will talk about Spotify, then we'll talk about Skyscanner, and then we will talk about Revolut. And we'll end the video with a final thought. So let's get started with Spotify. I remember in 2018 watching Spotify go public in a unique way. It wasn't through the traditional IPO process. Do you remember what they did? That's right. It was a direct listing. Spotify directly listed their shares on the New York Stock Exchange. In other words, they did not issue new shares. They just enabled their existing shareholders to sell their shares on the public market. This allowed Spotify to have the benefit of listing publicly, such as having liquid shares to give to employees or to use in a future acquisition. But by going public through a direct listing, Spotify also saved on banker fees. They didn't have to do a traditional IPO roadshow. They held an investor day instead. There was no lockup period for shareholders to sell, which is common in a traditional IPO, and there was no stock dilution, since Spotify did not raise money by selling additional shares. Well, it was a 12-year journey until Spotify went public. In 2006, Spotify was founded in Sweden. In 2008, Spotify received an investment from European VC Creendum. Just a note, the EIF was invested in Creendum. In 2015, it received investments that valued the company at approximately $8 billion. And in 2018, Spotify went public through a direct listing, trading shortly after at a valuation of over $30 billion. This is an example of a European startup that received an investment from a European venture capital firm and then became a unicorn. Now let's move on to Skyscanner. If you follow our YouTube channel, you know that we at Mink Learning spend quite a lot of our time in Europe and Asia conducting private equity boot camps. Well, how do you think our team at Mink Learning organizes our flights? That's right, we use Skyscanner. Skyscanner is a travel search engine that can help you search for flights, hotels, and car rentals. The reason we use Skyscanner is because it includes all possible flights, as opposed to many of the North American providers that may leave out certain airlines in Europe and Asia if they don't have specific partnerships with those airlines. Thanks to Skyscanner, we found great flights for our events that took us from Indonesia to Australia, Toronto to Zurich, Luxembourg to London, and more. Well, did you realize that in 2003, Skyscanner was founded in Scotland? In 2007, it received a £2.5 million investment from European venture capital firm Scottish Equity Partners for 40% equity in the business. Just a note, the EIF was invested in Scottish Equity Partners. In 2013, Sequoia invested in Skyscanner, valuing the company at $800 million. And in 2016, Skyscanner sold to Ctrip, a Chinese online travel company, which is now called Trip.com, and it was sold for £1.4 billion. This is another example of a European startup that received an investment from a European venture capital firm and then became a unicorn. So let's move on to Revolut. Do you know the name of the incubator based in London's Canary Wharf, where Revolut was started? That's right, it's Level 39, which is an incubator based in Canary Wharf in London. You know Canary Wharf. It's the mini city within a city that was built to model my hometown of Toronto. Hey, if you don't believe me, come to downtown Toronto, walk in the path, and see it for yourself. Well, in 2015, Level 39, which is located in the fantastically named building One Canada Square, was home to Revolut when it was founded. In that same year, Revolut raised $2.3 million in a round led by European venture capital firm Balderton. Just a note, the EIF was invested in Balderton. After that, Revolut raised capital in every year for the next 6 years, including in 2021, when it raised $800 million from large investors such as SoftBank and Tiger Global, which valued the firm at more than $30 billion. Revolut is now a large fintech company that offers banking and trading services around the world. This is another example of a European startup that received an investment from a European venture capital firm and then became a unicorn. Now, here's a final thought. Spotify, Skyscanner, and Revolut are only a small sample size of the unicorns that have come out of Europe. You also have Bolt from Estonia, Klarna from Sweden, Trivago that was started in a garage in Dusseldorf, Germany, and many more. There are quite a few venture capital firms in Europe that have the ability to help European startups on their journeys to become unicorns, just like Creandum did with Spotify, Scottish Equity Partners did with Skyscanner, and Balderton did with Revolut. Investors, if you are going to add venture capital to your portfolio, don't forget to consider Europe. There are many venture capital firms that have the skills and abilities to turn European startups into unicorns.